Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. Hello, John. We have a very special guest today.
Yes, Martin. We have Senator Malcolm Roberts from One Nation. Senators come on to discuss the upcoming legislation that we've discussed in the last few weeks, the currency restrictions on the use of cash bill 2019, i.e. Morrison's cash transaction ban bill. In our last episode, we basically, I made the offer to all members of Parliament, and I've made several private offers as well to any member of Parliament who was willing to come on the show and mainly talk about their opposition to the bill, but also if there was anyone who was willing to argue against our position and say that they support it, we were happy to interview. Well, Senator Roberts has agreed to come on and obviously express his party's position on this bill, and obviously this is important because we mobilised our audience to put in submissions to Treasury. The submission process ended this week on Monday. So now I've communicated with Treasury. Treasury has said that they won't tell me how many submissions have been submitted to date, but they said that submissions will be published in due course on the Treasury website. And so the stage where we're up to now is Treasury is now reviewing the submissions to date, and from our audience, hundreds of submissions have been submitted. And basically, once those submissions are considered by Treasury, the government has to make a decision as to do they make any changes to the draft legislation, and do they still bring it forward to Parliament. And obviously, the key thing is that Parliament comes back on the 9th of September, and given global and domestic events, I wouldn't be surprised if we could see this legislation come before the House of Representatives in the week commencing the 9th of September. So obviously there's still time to apply pressure on the government to reject this legislation, and that's obviously the editorial position that you and I have taken. But today's conversation is obviously here from One Nation and from Senator Roberts. So Senator Roberts, welcome for joining us.
Thank you very much, John. Pleasure to be here.
So, Senator, I think a good place to start would be with your party's position vis-a-vis this particular bill, which of course is currently a draft at the moment. Would be interested in your perspective and specifically what position you have taken.
Okay, we're opposed to the legislation. We won't be supporting it. We will not be supporting it. Cash is a valid currency exchange, and we're fine with cash.
Okay, well, that's good to hear, because I can tell you that a number of our viewers would agree with that position, which is does seem to be that civil liberties are being a bit eroded by effectively finding cash harder to use.
Well, a lot of our supporters certainly agree with this, and of course we do a lot of listening, and then we speak up as to what we're hearing from the people, and a lot of people are not happy with this bill.
So one of the things, of course, the bill is trying to attack is the so-called black economy, even though, of course, there are international experts that say, well, this approach to attacking the black economy is probably not that powerful at all. So what do you think about the government's position vis-a-vis black economy and this particular strategy for tackling it?
Well, there are already laws in place and recommendations in place. I believe that under terrorism laws, goods, assets can be confiscated, money can be confiscated if it's shown to be used criminally. We don't have much evidence of that actually following through. We understand also that the black economy, the so-called black economy, according to the government, is worth about $50 billion, and yet we already have laws in place that enable the government to strip assets, take assets, forfeit people's assets if they're found to be involved in criminal activities, and only 42 million was taken that way. So that's a long, long way short of $50 billion, and I don't think the government's really serious about this. When people end up with no cash, they have to go through the banks, so you can see who the big winner is.
Sure, Senator. So in terms of what you just said, when you said that you don't believe that the government is particularly serious about the black economy, so I mean, in terms of now, Martin and I have taken a particular position as to what we think the real agenda of the government is on this legislation. I mean, do you think that the government's intent on this legislation is the black economy, or do you think there's more issues on the table with the government's agenda?
I suspect, I don't know of course, but I suspect that it's got more to do with controlling people. That seems to be the case of driving many of Canberra's initiatives in recent decades, just to control people, whether it be stealing farmers' property rights without compensation under the guise of the UN's Kyoto Protocol. Under John Howard's government, and perpetuated by the Labor government, or stealing people's water property, water rights, and manipulating that, separating it from property rights, so a farmer can't use the water anymore, or whether it be any other means of control. Look at our electricity sector. We are the world's biggest exporter of energy in the form of natural gas and coal, and yet we have the highest electricity prices in the world. I mean, that's insane. I can remember growing up in the Hunter Valley and of New South Wales for part of my childhood, and I watched the Kurri Kurri aluminium smelter being built, and was built for one reason, and that was cheap electricity due to the Hunter Valley's clean coal. And now the Kurri Kurri smelter is shut. Tomago is complaining about viability problems. Other aluminium smelters have either shut or are talking now about shutting. We're destroying our electricity sector, we're destroying our energy sector, and yet we're exporting it to the world. So this is about serving the multinationals. You'll notice that, John, I'm sure you're aware of this, the multinationals could be paying us tens of billions of dollars in taxation, but the multinationals are paying very, very little. In fact, most large companies, 90% of Australia's large companies, are now foreign-owned, and since 1953 have paid little or no company tax. Now, the government goes out and it squawks. It builds facades and then pretends to implement them. But it's rubbish, because the government is not addressing the key tax loophole, which is foreign multinationals not paying company tax, foreign multinationals using what do they call that? Transfer pricing mechanisms to minimise tax if they do pay any tax. And so we see multinationals avoiding tax. We see massive exports of liquefied natural gas from the Northwest Shelf, and Australia gets very, very little out of that. The Japanese government gets $3 billion a year in import duties from our natural gas. So what we're about doing, what governments, are about doing in this country, is opening it up, let the foreigners have free slat on our assets, and don't get the money. Instead, they then come back and pretend to be doing things. This government is no different, in my opinion, to the Turnbull government. Scott Morrison is a facade builder. He's a marketer. He builds a facade, pretends to be doing something, and there's very little happening for the people behind that, whether it be proper relief for drought, investing in infrastructure for the future of our country. And that's another theme I want to touch on, John, that our productive capacity in this country is dwindling. It's being gutted. Energy, water, property rights. And yet that's where the future of production of our country will come from, the productive capacity that's being smashed. So we've got a government that's doing nothing but working for the multinationals, working for the major banks, and at the same time stealing from the people and gutting the people.
One point I'd like to follow up on is, obviously in the last few years we've had the Royal Commission into the banks, and obviously given that you're a senator from Queensland, a lot of Queenslanders, particularly in the farming sector, were hard done by the banks. So given what you just said in terms of you think that this bill around banning cash could be a way to force citizens into the banking system, I mean, given the context of the Royal Commission, I mean, what does that say about in terms of the government's sort of concerns for citizens in the wake of gross bank misconduct?
Well, I'd like to remind everyone, John, that Senator Pauline Hanson, got a bank inquiry, a Senate select inquiry into lending to primary production customers, and we went out and listened to the people, encouraged them to make submissions from forestry, agriculture, and fishing. We got submissions. Our staff went out, actually helped people with them, because it's not easy making a submission sometimes, especially in these complex issues. Then I went out again with my staff, with Pauline, Senator Hanson's staff, and we helped the farmers to prepare their submissions, their verbal submissions in hearings. Then we chaired them in the bush, and then we got that information, and then we held the banks accountable. And it was only then, John, that the National Party started putting pressure on the Liberals, because we were exposing the banks for what they were doing, the criminal activities, the fraud, the stealing of property, the gross negligence, the gross corruption in some of the banks. And then as a result of what we did, that put so much pressure on the government. The government then had its own Royal Commission. But the Royal Commission was hobbled by the terms of reference, which were inadequate. We advocated broader terms of reference, but the government didn't do that. And now what you'll find is, under both Labor and Liberal, they've gone silent. And you'll be hearing more about this from us in coming months. But the government has gone silent on the Royal Commission. The government is not doing much at all. It's just yet another box ticked, flicked, and get on with it, pretend to be doing something. the Royal Commission won't be implemented, I believe, without us chasing it. We will chase it. We will chase the implementation of our own recommendations from our Senate Select Inquiry into lending to primary production customers. But we will chase these things. It's difficult when Labor and Liberal combine to have the majority. They whistled through the IMF bill, giving $4 billion to the IMF a couple of years ago. They whistled through the bank bail-in bill. They actually took a shortcut there. And both Labor and Liberal combined to get their numbers. And I believe that's probably what will happen here, unless listeners, viewers put pressure on the Labor Party and really force the Labor Party to wake up to itself and protect the people of this country, because the Liberals are not going to do that.
And I have a broader question which comes directly back to that, which if you look back over the last few years, there have been various attempts, I think, to crimp and squeeze civil liberties. What does that say about Australia more generally, do you think?
Well, I think we're becoming more and more of a controlled society. And Martin, the Constitution makes it very clear that the majority of decisions by government should be done at the state level. And there's a very, very good reason for that. In the 18th century, 1700s, the Americans had their Civil War and they looked to Europe and they said, we don't want that. We don't want central governments run by central banks. We don't want endless wars, repeated wars. We don't want welfare systems that are abused. And so the Americans came up with a wonderful form of competitive federalism. Each of the 13 founding states, now 50 states, is a sovereign entity, independent in its own right. They are supposed to be doing most of the governing, most of the services that government provides. The federal government was deliberately locked out of that. And when the Australians when we came to develop our constitution in the late 19th century and leading up to 1901, our forefathers looked to the American model of competitive federalism, and they loved that, and they enshrined that in our constitution. But that's been eroded. So let me give you an example of competitive federalism at work. What it means is that a state will come up with a better way of raising revenue, a more efficient way of using revenue. It'll get by with less revenue from its taxpayers. So once that is enshrined in that state, then the other states will copy. Now, an example of that people can probably remember is Joh Bjelke-Petersen abolishing death duties in Queensland. I think it was in the late 1970s, early 80s. And what happened as a result of that? Many people many retirees left the southern states and retired in Queensland because that was the best place to die, because they could leave all of their funds and assets to their kids. As a result, the other states were losing their wealth, so they all abolished death duties. Now we've got, in the last election campaign, the federal opposition under Bill Shorten and the Greens and some unions reportedly wanting to bring back centralised death duties. So when you've got a centralised tax, you've got a centralised function, there's no competition for it, there's no accountability. One of the biggest problems we have in Canberra is the almost complete lack of accountability. If it wasn't for us speaking up, then there wouldn't be any accountability at all. So what we need to do is get back to competitive federalism, where the states are doing the majority of the decision-making, majority of the services. We need to get health back to the states entirely. We need to get education back to the states. We need to get environment back to the states. Most things in Canberra can go back to the states, and then we'll have real accountability and real competitive federalism. That's what we need. That's a fundamental change. And what's happened is that was the start of our constitution in 1901, but it's been eroded ever since. And now the federal government has got far too much power, unaccountable power, unilateral power. And what it also does, John and Martin, is that it enables foreign entities to sneak things through to steal our sovereignty, to steal our governance. And we've got a lot of the UN laws, UN rules and regulations are being pushed, and that's what's destroying our water sector. That's what's destroying our energy sector. That's what's destroying property rights. Basic freedoms are being stolen, Martin, as you quite correctly said, and it's being done through a central government that has got very little accountability and that is pushing UN global governance agenda. I mean, Nigel Farage has been talking about this publicly in Britain for 20 years. He was out here in CPAC conference, which I had the pleasure of attending and meeting Nigel Farage and speaking there myself. And it's quite clear that we're not being governed by Australians anymore. And that's what this needs to get back. If we're not being governed by the banks, we're being governed by the UN. It's quite clear. And that's what this legislation is about. It's about making sure the banks have even more power.
I was going to ask you, Senator, so do you think that parliamentarians have a lack of commitment to civil liberties and economic freedom?
Yes, I do, because what happens is in the majority of both the failed old parties, the majority of MPs know that to get pre-selection, they have to kowtow to the backroom party power brokers. In the Liberal Party, that's a small group of people. In the Labor Party, it's a small group of former union bosses largely. And these power brokers say, John, if you don't vote according to the way the party tells you, you will not be pre-selected. End of story. And so that's what happens. So that's what we've basically got, with few exceptions. We've got two mobs. We've got the Labor mob and the Liberal mob, run by just a handful of people, each of them. And when you combine them, and quite often they do combine, then you've got one mob in Canberra. Now, there are some noted exceptions in the Liberal Party. There are still a few Liberals who stand up. I can think of Craig Kelly, for example, Andrew Hastie, Kevin Andrews, and some of the other really decent Liberals who will speak up. But even they, I can think of Erica Betts, even these people who have shown integrity and shown their support for the people of Australia, even these people are corralled at times and suppressed. So what we've got, we need to have a democracy, and that's why I say again, come back to competitive federalism and real accountability.
The other question I have is, because of what you just said, Senator, so do you think our audience obviously doesn't want this legislation to go through. Yep. So do you think this legislation, do you think it's a done deal, or do you think there's still a chance where we could actually apply enough pressure on Parliament to start to actually not have this legislation passed?
That's an interesting question, and I try to not to make statements unless they're based on fact. So I'm going to make that very clear that my response is an opinion. I haven't got the facts on it. I believe the Liberal Party will try to whistle it through. I believe the Labor Party will try to whistle it through, and the two will join, and it'll just go straight through, unless the people stand up and put pressure on the Labor Party. The Labor Party is destroying itself, and it has to show some support and some guts, otherwise it is finished. So if your viewers, if many people around Australia, everyday Aussies, contact the Labor Party MPs, where even outside their own electorates, contact Labor Party senators in their state and even outside their state, and tell these people in the Labor Party to vote against this legislation, to stand up for the people of Australia and for freedoms in this country and vote against it. That's our only hope. We will be speaking up strongly publicly and in Parliament against this bill, and we will be rallying support around it. But we need the Labor Party to stand up and be true to the workers of this country, because they're the people who will be affected when the banks take over.
So, Senator, one of the things that I've been intrigued about is the lack of coverage in the mainstream media of this whole issue and this whole bill. What do you think that says about our media?
Well, it says that they're owned. I've got a fabulous staffer in my staff team, and he's provided the figures that show that three large companies are the largest, three largest shareholders on the whole Australian stock market. They are Citibank, JP Morgan, HSBC, major international banks. These are the largest shareholders in the Australian stock market. They control Australia's 14 largest companies, including media companies. And if this is good for the banks, and that's what I believe it is, then they will be putting pressure on the media companies to keep their mouths shut. So that's why they'll indicate that people will think, that they'll be fooled into thinking that there's no opposition to it. So that's my opinion.
In terms of viewers trying to get their heads around this and perhaps even wanting to connect with your party with regard to this particular legislation, what's the best way for people to connect with you?
Probably through Facebook, because we get swamped. As people are so disillusioned with the Labor Party and the Liberal Party, both the failed old parties, they come increasingly to us, and we get swamped with requests for assistance and support. So we're working out ways of trying to make sure that we can reply to everyone in a sensible, respectful way. But it's just so difficult at the moment. We're a brand new office. We're swamped. So I would suggest that people stay tuned to Pauline Hanson's Please Explain Facebook page and to Malcolm Roberts, Senator for Queensland Facebook page, and we'll be giving you information through there.
The only thing that we can do to stop this legislation, Senator, is, in your view, is for citizens to take active measures to apply direct pressure to parliamentarians, so parliamentarians know that this is actually a big deal and they shouldn't go ahead. They shouldn't go forward with what the Prime Minister is suggesting.
Correct, and I think that that's the best way for everyday Aussies to do that. But I think there are other things that we need to consider in the way we run our country. If the black economy is such a big detour around the main part of our economy, then we need to think about why it's such a big detour and how come it's that way. So we need to make it easier for people to pay tax. Most Australians will pay tax if they believe it's fair and transparent and equitable. But then they resent paying tax when multinationals come in here, take our resources, use our infrastructure, and governments don't get their fair share of tax out of the multinationals. We need all parties in our country, not just political parties, I mean all parties, companies and individuals, retailers, to pay a fair share of tax. We also need, for example, I can remember, John, back in the late 20th century, the 1990s, early 2000s, I saw a figure from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. I can't find it, but it was something like 68%. A person on the average income in Australia would pay 68% of their income to governments in the form of rates, levies, fees, charges, taxes, special levies. So that means that, contrary to what people think, housing is not an individual's biggest purchase. By far the biggest purchase of someone in this country is government, and most of it is compulsory. And so we have got a huge burden, and yet we're paying enormously to government, 68%. Another figure I remember from that era, and this came out from Jim Kalali, who was former Deputy Commissioner for Taxation in charge of large companies and international matters. He said that 90% of Australia's large companies are foreign-owned and since 1953 have paid little or no tax. That's when the Liberals changed the law to enable foreign companies to just bypass the tax measures. In Japan, foreign companies are about 2.5%, or they were 10 years ago. In Britain and America, it's around about 12.5%. In Australia, 90%. So foreign companies are coming in here, using our assets, using our education system, relying on our defence system to enable the security of their Northwest Shelf gas and other resources. And they're not doing anything for it. They're raping us. And we need to change our tax system to make it so that people believe it's fair and honest, and so that everyone pays their fair share. That would reduce the tax on individuals. We've got to come up with a better way of levying our tax system. And that's something that this country has shied away from. Labor and Liberal will not face up and address comprehensive tax reform because they smash each other over it. They tell lies over it. I'll give you an example. Paul Keating was the first to introduce the GST as a concept to Australia. When it dropped, because Bob Hawke ran out of courage in putting it forward, you may remember this, a few years later, John Hewson raised it, and Keating smashed him on it. So what we see is that the Labor Party raised the GST as an option. The Liberal Party then adopted it, and the Labor Party smashed them on it. So you can't get a fair exchange on taxation system at the moment. So what we need to do is to have an open discussion on the problems of our tax system, because that's at the heart of this. That's what's driving these behaviours. We then need to have an open discussion on the principles for fair, efficient, equitable taxation and effective taxation. And then we need to get on with designing the system, because the current system is just too cumbersome, too inefficient, too dishonest, and lacking transparency. And we also need the ATO to start focusing on the big boys, not the small businesses, because they're easy to take to court. The multinationals have deep pockets and the ATO can't win. So the ATO goes after small companies and after individuals, and sometimes the ATO is being misdirected. So what we need to do is understand the taxation system, understand what people need in this country for fairness, and get on with that job instead of propping up the banks and the large multinationals.
Senator Malcolm Roberts, thank you very much for your time today. Both John and I appreciate it, and in the interest of the people, we'll keep spreading the word.
Okay, thank you very much. You're welcome, Martin. John, thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people, we'll see you next time.